Hi, I'm Melissa Smith.
I'm Spencer Ziegler.
And I'm Serena Halstead. Welcome to Data Lit Podcast and to our latest series on feedback. As mentioned in our earlier episode, the first part of this series will focus on the what, why, who, and how of feedback. And then we'll have the second part, we'll have some special guests. Now, in our last episode, we focused on the why of feedback. We established that feedback has a significant effect on students' learning, and that this is an important part of the assessment process. In today's episode, we will identify the who of feedback. A quote I had here from MindTool is that when done right, when it is done in the right way, with the right intentions, feedback can lead to outstanding performance. Spencer, Melissa, who gives feedback?
So it's anybody who is in that teaching and learning cycle. So as long as teaching and learning is going on, any of those players can give feedback. So the teacher, whoever's playing the teacher role, it can come back. It can come from the student, it can come from peers, and it can even come from yourself, right? You can give yourself feedback as you're doing something. That's probably, as you're working on something, the first set of feedback that you get is from yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the resources you might have access to. Some solid feedback can come from podcast hosts. I think that's an important one.
Okay. Yes, right. I like where we're going with this. So in the article, Feedback for Learning, 7 Keys to Effective Feedback, author Grant Wiggin stated that feedback is information about how we are doing in our efforts to reach a goal. And I want to touch on that word goal for a second, because whenever we're thinking of giving feedback, it's always where the learner or the person who is doing something has some purpose, right? So that purpose is I need to get this done or I need to get that done. But there is always this goal to be accomplished, right? So who gets feedback? We can get, as Melissa said, the feedback can come from ourselves, or it can be the critique from others. So an example I have here, and forgive me, it's early and I'm thinking food, but I was thinking for this example, if I'm baking banana bread, I can taste it, right? And I can decide on whether it meets my expectations. So my goal is that I wanted a banana bread that is moist and it should be delicious. So that feedback to myself would be where I taste it for myself. Now, hopefully, I'm critiquing myself based on what I know quality banana bread should taste like, right? Now, feedback can also come from others, right? And using the same goals, that it should be moist, it should be delicious, I could ask my friends to taste it and then tell me what they think of it. So that's where we have that, feedback from ourselves, feedback from others. Now, notice whether the feedback is from self or others, there's always this pre-established goal. An essential element of feedback identified by Wiggins is that it should be goal referenced. Mm-hmm. Wiggins stated that effective feedback requires that a person has a goal, take action to achieve the goal, and receive goal-related information about his or her action. So when I'm thinking this goal here, do not come and tell me something that was not related to what I was asking you. All right. So for the feedback to be effective, it must be in line with what the goal was. He also noted that information becomes feedback if and only if I'm trying to cause something, and the information tells me whether I'm on track or I need to change the course. Now let us talk about the opportunities of feedback and specifically the who. So Melissa has touched on some of them already. So we have 4 feedback relationships that we can consider. We have the teacher to learner, learner to learner, learner to self, and learner to teacher. And I'm going to start with the most obvious one that we are all familiar with, the most popular one, the teacher to learner. So teachers are the expert source of information. And so students are always looking to the teacher to give that feedback. So that's the one that everybody is more familiar with. And teachers, when giving feedback, they provide, constructive feedback that matches the criteria for the assessment. Whatever the student is doing, they will give constructive feedback in regards to that. A prerequisite for effective feedback is for teachers to clarify the expectations and standards for the student. Now let us talk about the ones that are not so much, well, it's happening, but maybe on a less popular note, right? So the learner. This is where students evaluate each other's work. We see this occurring mostly, like, for example, in group work, presentation, where students might, critique each other's work and tell each other how to improve something. And this is more for the formative assessment practices. We see that mostly occurring there. I was reading this article and I came across this one that says the impact of feedback on academic performance. And this was by author McGrane and Hopfenbeck. They said that peer assessment, and I'm going to switch up the words here by saying peer feedback, can have positive effect on learning, but may be hampered by social factors such as friendship, collusion, and perceived fairness. Melissa, Spencer, what are your thoughts on the influence of peer feedback as it relates to students' learning?
Yeah, so I think, that study that you mentioned by Double, I think that shows that peer feedback, when implemented effectively, can be incredibly powerful. It says that the results indicate peer assessment is more effective than no assessment, teacher assessment. So I think that's research backed. And for why that can be, I think there's an interesting article by Dylan William, Embedded Formative Assessment, that kind of unpacks why. And he writes that when students provide feedback to each other, they're forced to internalize the learning intentions and success criteria, but in the context of someone else's work, which is much less emotionally charged. Activating students as learners for one another can therefore be seen as a stepping stone to students becoming owners of their own learning. So I think that kind of explains why it can be really influential.
And I think what you just said there about activating learners, like we mentioned in the last episode about the why feedback is valuable, because again, learning is something that's internalized, right? It's you, the learner, has to take ownership in it. And so that activating the learners, whether it's self or each other, that's a key part to the learning process.
I'm looking at this part in particular where it says it can be hampered by social factors. So, giving that peer feedback, depending on who is my friend, I maybe want to be more mindful because I don't want to maybe hurt my friend's feeling, right? Some of that goes on into peer assessment. And then collusion, I was just thinking maybe, one group trying to outdo the other group. So maybe they're not so fair in giving their feedback. So that the who makes a big difference in how the feedback is received.
But I think,
go ahead.
So one of the while those are possible drawbacks, I think the research and practice, what we've seen is try to use peer feedback, not for grading purposes, but I think you mentioned this, Serena, as in the formative process. And instead of it having to be a grade, if you lessen the grading part, I think you lessen that need for the collusion or the having to be fair. And they talk about trying, when you're using peer feedback, to make sure that it's affirmative or suggestive. So you're either affirming something or you're making suggestions, but not letting it be corrective. I think that. if you focus on those two, either in your peer feedback, having it be either affirmative or suggestive, and less on that grading piece or corrective piece, it's one way of lessening the need for some of that collusion or because you're my friend, you can be a little bit more objective, I guess.
Melissa, I like the way you answer that. And you kind of basically started answering the next question that I have. So the next question that I have for both is that what are some things that teachers need to consider when they ask students to give each other feedback on work?
So I'd say, for one, just to teach students some of these strategies that we're talking about in this series and that you might kind of come across in your own studies. Because if we're saying, this is all about how to deliver effective feedback, and in this series, Serena, you're saying students should be delivering some of that too, then they would benefit from knowing some of these strategies, knowing some of these ideas about feedback on the processing and self-regulation, as opposed to just the self, about kind of digging into knowing the goal behind it. All that is going to benefit them in school. And also, one of the nice things about the series is just this general life skills. Like Melissa, you mentioned the last kind of episode about just, it's good to know for your kids or in other relationships. It's helpful to know how to give decent feedback.
And I think too, I can't stress, and I know for some really sound like a broken record by this point, but it's the culture that you create, right? So that, again, learning from my mistake, I just can't come one day and say, all right, we're going to give each other feedback. Like I have to kind of talk about feedback. I have to model it for them. I have to give an example of it and create a culture of giving feedback to each other where we can be objective, right? So that they know that we are helping each other and this is part of a collaborative learning process. So again, I think looking at the culture, looking at the environment and teaching, because it's not a natural thing we want to do. I think naturally we probably want to be competitive, right? And when you are doing peer feedback, less on the competition and more, again, that side by side where we are on the same level and I can point out, here's a way to improve and I can receive that, just like you can point out to me ways I need to improve and I can receive that. And we see each other as equals.
So I like both responses here. So I'm gathering this idea that when teachers ask students to give feedback, it is important for them to review with students the accuracy of their feedback, right? And this reviewing requires you teaching them how to, because it's just the same way we have to teach other things. We need to teach students about how to give feedback and how to determine whether the feedback they're providing to each other, is it accurate? So we're moving into the next one, learner to self. So this is where students are evaluating their own work for the purpose of improving it. We know that when students are able to ask questions, independent learning takes place. So in another article here on student self-assessment, making standards come alive, author Linda Bruce, she mentioned that for students to be good evaluators of their work, they need a clear target, the opportunity to help create a definition of quality work, they need feedback, and the opportunity to correct or self-adjust their work before they turn it in. Now, I like that last piece here where we talk about the opportunity to self-correct it. So that learner to self, I need to get that opportunity of fixing it up before I give it to you. Melissa, Spencer, what are some things teachers need to assist students with to ensure students make accurate self-assessment of their own work?
So again, I think with giving feedback to self, it is a skill set that you have to practice over and over and model, right? And it's made easier when you have those learning targets and criteria, either criteria that comes from the teacher or, as the article suggests, involving kids in setting up that criteria. So those two things, I think, for me, from in the classroom, that helps with self-assessment, right? But when you can tell kids, all right, go back and look at your work, you self-assess first before you turn it in. I think that helps when you have that target and the criteria. That's a strategy I sort of use where, you check first before you come to me. And again, that's happening in that formative assessment, right? To me, I feel as though students are more apt or interested in that level of feedback when there's less of that pressure of it's for a formal grade, that they're still in that practice phase. They're more apt to involve themselves in the self-feedback when it's like, okay, I still have a chance to adjust.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's some that Bill Ferreter and Paul Cancellieri, who we'll talk to in a couple episodes, point out in their book that the best feedback progressions begin long before students complete any work, as teachers help them identify outcomes worth mastering. So that's a point that we've hit a few of these times, that if they know the goal first, then that's going to unpack a lot of these. And I also like Susan Brookhart points out kind of 4 kind of practical things that teachers can do to help students with self-assessment. So she says, first, model giving and using feedback yourself. So they see you doing it. Second, so teach them some of these specific self and peer assessment skills, like where feedback comes from, like we've discussed, thinking about it, ownership, them asking and answering their own questions, self-regulation skills. Third, she points out, be clear about the learning target and the criteria for good work so that, what we've discussed, that goal, and then also clear rubrics that they know how to use. And then fourth, I think this is key, design lessons in which students use feedback on previous work to produce better work. So have them dig through feedback that they've received and then clear time and space for them to apply it to future assignments. So that could be redoing assignments, that could be giving new but similar assignments, she points out, just one way or another, so that they can see the connection between the feedback they received and using that to change future actions. So those are 4 steps that I think is helpful coming from Brookhart.
Yes, that is really good. I like that. That clearly gives me some tools here to help my students with self-feedback. So the last but not least, learner to teacher. This is where students are going to the teacher and telling the teacher, information about what they have uncovered while they're doing the work, right? So feedback from student to teacher provides evidence for teacher to consider his or her impact upon learning and reasons to adjust instructions and future feedback processes. Melissa, Spencer, what are some practical ways that you got feedback from students when you were in the classroom?
So for me, the getting feedback from students, again, requires an intentional practice, right? The first way I had heard about this type of practice is, at the end of a class, asking students to sort of fill out what do they think about the class, what do they think about me as a teacher. And I realized, okay, the kids that like you say positive things, and the kids that didn't like you say negative things. And I recognized, okay, well, that's not helpful either to myself or to the students, either whether the students like me or not. And I had to sort of figure out what's a different way to elicit feedback from students, because I don't want feedback technically about the course, but I want feedback from them about where they are in their understanding, so that I can help them, again, achieve the target. And one of the ways is questions, right? So I can get feedback from them based on the questions that they ask. And so one of the things that I tried to do is we had these question stems, and in creating our classroom culture, there were some questions that were okay to ask of a teacher. Now, middle school kids want to be able to ask a teacher question, especially if they think that they're going to put you on the spot. So I will put that out there. So we definitely had to create a culture, but we kind of had some okay questions for them to ask in class. Was, can you explain that? What do you mean by? Is there another method too? Like those sort of questions empower them to ask me a question, and then I get feedback. It's not so much feedback on how the class is, it's kind of thing, but it's feedback on where they are in their learning and understanding, so that I can move forward.
Yeah. And that's like thinking back to when I was in the classroom, I think I did a decent job at modeling and putting it in front for every kid to see what you do when you accept feedback, and then kind of swallow down your pride, and then to say specifically, based on your feedback, I'm changing X, Y, or Z in tomorrow's lesson or something. So I think that's really helpful to model. I got feedback and I made these changes, and I think that liberates them to do the same. Where I wish I could step in the Wayback Machine and make changes was the intentionality part that Melissa pointed out, of just, I think when feedback naturally popped up because the classroom culture is good at using it, but I wasn't good at creating systems, equitable systems where every single kid would provide me feedback. So I was probably only getting feedback from kids that were extroverted, or kids that had that relationship with me, that they felt that they could give me feedback. But then I was missing probably a lot of really useful data from kids that maybe were a little more shy, or maybe for whom it wasn't working. So I think creating some systems, like say on the rubric, kids should be doing self-assessment too, maybe building into the rubric itself a spot for them to give me feedback on what was going on in that lesson, that unit. So I wish that's something that I could have been more conscious about, creating systems where every kid is giving me feedback so I can use that to drive instruction.
And I like the fact that you mentioned every kid. So on that note, question here. Do you think the who of feedback makes a difference in what the learner accepts?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like you mentioned earlier, Grant Wiggins' elements of feedback, the goal reference being one a key part of that, but also in other words, that user-friendly. And feedback's only useful if it's received and digested. So I think there's some value in sometimes the who being the teacher, sometimes it being the peers, sometimes the self, sometimes resources, all those kind of things. It probably varies with the task, and it probably varies with kid by kid as well. So I think being really thoughtful and conscious about these 4 different relationships that you laid out, Serena, is going to really help teachers to find ways so that the feedback is user-friendly and is digested by every kid.
And I think too, in addition to that, intentionality, the culture has to be there. I cannot, from my own lessons that I have learned going back, working on that culture piece kind of helps with that, who the learner is accepting it from, right? And again, the space in which it's done. If a lot of this type of feedback we're talking about is in that formative space and not in that summative space. And I feel as though when it happens in that formative space, it's okay to make errors. It's okay to have a weakness. Like in those spaces, that is okay. And so it's all right to accept feedback from a peer or from yourself, or to be able to give feedback to a peer or to the teacher. Because again, it's in that formative space where we're still learning and we're learning collaboratively. We're all learning together. So I do think the culture and the teaching of the skills and being patient with ourselves and the process and putting process in place all affects how the learner and who the learner accepts the feedback from.
Melissa, you nicely summarized this episode here on the who of feedback. And so that's a parting note here. So feedback has the potential to be increasingly powerful when the task and the criteria for success can be matched to challenging learning goals. So that's what we started off with. Whoever is giving the feedback, there must be some goal. And we don't just want any kind of goal. It must be some rigorous goal that the learner is interested in reaching, right? Because one of the things where we can set goals with, if that's not the student's intention, then that's another case. So, feedback should be generated from challenging goals. Like I said, this concludes our episode on the who of feedback. So in looking at the who of feedback, we looked at the relationships and we established that we can have teacher to learner, the learner to learner, learner to self, and then learner to teacher. We have looked at ways in which we can make this work for students. We realize that we have to set up the culture for it and that we have to teach students how to give good feedback. So stay tuned for our next episode on the how of feedback. For more information on this topic and others, go to www.wcpss.net/datalit. You can send us questions there or leave a comment. Goodbye.
Bye.
Take care.